You wake up, reach for your phone, and for a brief second you expect something, a message, a notification, a signal that somewhere, someone is thinking about you. But the screen is silent. And in that silence, something heavier than loneliness settles in your chest. Not noise, not chaos, just a quiet absence that society has trained you to fear. You scroll, faces smiling, groups laughing, people gathering, connecting, belonging. And without anyone saying it directly, a message is delivered to your subconscious. If you are alone, something must be wrong with you. If your circle is small, your worth must be small. If your life is quiet, your existence must be defective. But that assumption is not psychological truth. It is social conditioning. Modern society interprets solitude as a symptom, a disorder, a failure of adaptation. Yet psychology, evolution, and human behavioral patterns suggest something far more complex. What if your solitude is not a weakness, but a protective response of a mind that refuses artificial connection? What if the absence of shallow bonds is not a social failure, but a psychological filtration system? There is an idea often discussed in evolutionary behavioral theory. As an organism becomes more specialized, more precise, and more self-sufficient, its circle naturally contracts. Herd animals survive in groups. Predators, observers, and strategists often operate alone, not because they are incapable of connection, but because their internal wiring rejects noise that does not align with their perception of reality. If you have felt out of place for most of your life, this is not random. It is not accidental. It is a pattern. You likely learned early that wearing social masks felt unnatural, that forced enthusiasm, rehearsed conversations, and performative friendships felt like acting in a play you never auditioned for. While others flowed effortlessly through social rituals, you observed. You analyzed. You sensed inconsistencies between what people said and what they meant. And over time, something subtle happened. You withdrew, not out of fear, but out of psychological dissonance. One of the rare cognitive traits associated with prolonged solitude is heightened pattern recognition. Most individuals process conversations at a surface level, words, tone, and immediate emotional cues. But a more observant mind tracks microexpressions, pauses, contradictions, and behavioral patterns over time. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as thin-slice perception, the ability to detect underlying truths from small behavioral fragments. When someone praises you with forced enthusiasm, you notice the tension in their expression. When someone agrees too quickly, you detect hesitation beneath compliance. When a group laughs, you sense the hierarchy behind the humor. Social interactions, for you, are not simple exchanges. They are layered data streams. And this creates friction, because once you see the performance, it becomes difficult to participate in it authentically. Conversations begin to feel scripted. Gatherings feel energetically chaotic. Not because people are malicious, but because much of social behavior is unconsciously performative, a negotiation for acceptance, status, and belonging. To the average person, this performance feels normal. To a highly observant mind, it feels artificial. And artificial environments trigger psychological withdrawal. Another factor emerges: intolerance for cognitive shallowness. Not arrogance, not superiority, but cognitive mismatch. Personality psychology research consistently shows that individuals with a high need for cognition experience mental fatigue during prolonged shallow interaction. Small talk, repetitive topics, and surface-level exchanges do not stimulate the same neurological reward systems as deep, meaningful discourse. While others bond through shared gossip, routine complaints, or social rituals, your mind seeks depth, ideas, systems, meaning, patterns, future implications, existential questions. When conversations repeatedly return to trivial loops, your mental energy depletes rather than replenishes. This is not antisocial behavior. It is energy economics of the mind. Imagine a deep-sea diver placed in shallow water. The environment is not hostile. It is simply incompatible. The depth they are adapted to does not exist there. Over time, they stop diving, not because they forgot how, but because there is nowhere deep enough to go. Now consider another psychological dimension: resistance to unconscious control structures within social groups. Most social circles operate on unspoken agreements, shared opinions, shared dislikes, shared norms, shared emotional reactions. Conformity becomes the price of belonging. Classic social psychology experiments, such as those exploring group conformity dynamics, demonstrate that a majority of individuals will align with group opinion even when it contradicts observable reality. But not all minds comply equally. Some individuals exhibit strong, autonomy-driven cognition. They require internal logical alignment before agreement. They do not accept ideas solely because they are popular, emotionally convenient, or socially rewarded. This trait often leads to friction within group environments, particularly those built on emotional consensus rather than rational dialogue. When a group subtly demands alignment, an autonomous mind experiences psychological suffocation rather than comfort. Not rebellion for the sake of rebellion, but resistance to internal incongruence. Over time, this resistance is misinterpreted. Labels emerge: difficult, intense, hard to read. Yet beneath these labels lies a simpler truth. The individual cannot convincingly perform agreement when their cognition detects contradiction. And so, distance forms. Another layer appears when purpose enters the equation. Many individuals use social interaction as a primary method of time regulation, filling empty hours with shared activity, conversation, and distraction. But a mind oriented toward long-term construction experiences time differently, not as something to pass, but as something to allocate. Neuroscience identifies two dominant cognitive modes: the default mode network, associated with social reflection and wandering thought, and the task-positive network, associated with deep focus and goal-oriented execution. These systems are neurologically anti-correlated. Sustained focus often reduces social engagement, and sustained social engagement disrupts deep focus. This creates a psychological trade-off. If you are internally driven to build, whether ideas, skills, philosophies, or personal transformation, prolonged social immersion can feel like cognitive fragmentation. Invitations become interruptions. Noise becomes distraction. And eventually, fewer invitations arrive, not necessarily because of rejection, but because your behavioral signals indicate selective engagement. From the outside, this appears as isolation. From the inside, it often feels like alignment. There is also a subtler psychological phenomenon at play: the mirror effect of self-awareness. Individuals with high introspective depth and emotional containment often function as psychological mirrors in social environments. Their quiet presence amplifies the internal noise of others. Without excessive self-disclosure or performative validation, they create a reflective space that unconsciously forces others to confront their own insecurities. This can generate discomfort, not because silence is hostile, but because it removes distraction. When someone who relies heavily on external validation encounters someone internally anchored, The contrast becomes psychologically destabilizing. The ego, seeking equilibrium, may reinterpret this discomfort as dislike, intimidation, or perceived judgment, even when none is expressed. Thus, tension forms without direct conflict. Another contributing factor is temporal orientation. Many individuals are primarily present-focused, driven by immediate emotional experiences and short-term rewards. However, some minds naturally simulate long-term trajectories, consequences, patterns, and future scenarios. This forward-oriented cognition creates a perceptual gap. While others discuss immediate events, the future-oriented mind analyzes long-term implications. While others seek entertainment, it seeks trajectory. While others prioritize emotional comfort, it prioritizes strategic alignment. This mismatch in temporal focus can make conversations feel disconnected, even when intentions are positive. Connection requires synchronization of mental timelines. Without it, dialogue feels asynchronous. Then there is the rare psychological structure known as an autotelic orientation, a personality pattern in which motivation is internally generated rather than externally reinforced. Individuals with this structure derive satisfaction from the process itself, not from applause, validation, or social recognition. They read because curiosity demands it. They build because internal vision compels it. They reflect because awareness is intrinsically rewarding. In a society that uses attention as currency, an internally motivated individual becomes difficult to influence through approval or exclusion. Social leverage weakens. External validation loses its regulatory power. And unconsciously, many social environments gravitate toward dynamics where mutual validation sustains cohesion. Remove the need for validation, and the dynamic shifts. Now observe the pattern as a whole. Heightened perception, depth preference, autonomy of thought, future orientation, internal motivation, purpose-driven focus, reflective presence. When these traits converge, the result is not necessarily social incompetence. It is social selectivity shaped by psychological structure. This does not mean humans do not need connection. They do. But not all forms of connection nourish the psyche equally. Shallow compatibility may provide stimulation but not resonance. And a mind attuned to authenticity will eventually reject prolonged exposure to misaligned interactions, even at the cost of solitude. However, there is a psychological danger here that must be acknowledged with intellectual honesty. Extended isolation, even when initially chosen, can gradually distort self-perception. The mind begins to question its own narrative. Doubt emerges. Internal dialogue shifts from observation to self-criticism. Perhaps the distance is not alignment, but defect. Perhaps the silence is not clarity, but rejection. This is the cognitive trap of prolonged solitude. To avoid it, one must reframe solitude not as abandonment, but as a developmental phase. Throughout history, periods of intentional withdrawal have accompanied intellectual, creative, and philosophical evolution, not as escape from humanity, but as refinement of identity before meaningful engagement. Solitude, in this context, becomes a laboratory rather than a prison, a space where cognitive standards stabilize, where internal noise settles, where purpose clarifies without constant external interference. It is within sustained silence that self-concept detaches from social expectation and reconnects with intrinsic direction. This does not eliminate the human need for rare, meaningful connection. It refines it. Instead of seeking constant interaction, the psyche begins to seek resonance. Individuals capable of depth, authenticity, and intellectual alignment. Such connections are statistically rare, not because they do not exist, but because they require mutual psychological compatibility rather than proximity or convenience. Until such resonance appears, the empty space in your life is not necessarily absence. It may be filtration, an unoccupied seat reserved not for noise, but for alignment, not for distraction, but for understanding, not for quantity, but for quality of presence. And perhaps the most important realization is this: solitude, when misunderstood, feels like exclusion. But when understood, it becomes sovereignty over one's mental environment. The ability to choose silence over superficiality, depth over distraction, authenticity over performance. So the question is no longer whether solitude makes you broken. The deeper question is whether your mind simply refuses environments that require you to become someone you are not. If that is the case, then your silence is not emptiness. It is discernment. Your distance is not weakness. It is psychological selectivity. And your solitude is not the end of connection, but the beginning of conscious connection. Reflect on that the next time the world equates noise with belonging and silence with failure. Because sometimes the quietest life is not the loneliest one. It is the most internally aligned one. And if this reflection resonated with something unspoken within you, then perhaps this space, this quiet exploration of the mind, is exactly where you are meant to be right now. Stay with Beyond the Twist for more deep psychological narratives that uncover the hidden patterns shaping human behavior, and continue the journey inward, where the real understanding always begins.